This is an IBM 5150. This computer was intended to be used mostly with one or two floppy drives to load an included or upgraded version of IBM DOS. DOS does, of course, stand for Disk Operating System. But not long after the 5150 was released came the 5160, the XT class computer. Featuring an included hard disk with an immense 10 megabyte capacity, users would no longer have to load the floppy disk every time they wanted to use the computer. This hard disk revolution wasn't bound for the 5150 though. Its original 63-watt power supply wasn't up to the task of running one of the hungry MFM hard disks that IBM was selling. There was an option to get an external drive in the 5161 case, which had its own power supply, but since it was much more than just a hard disk, it would have cost roughly 2/3 of what the 5150 alone had cost. But those are just the official IBM methods. Of course, people found a way of putting hard disks on their 5150s. After upgrading the power supply, you could ditch the second floppy drive for an MFM drive, or later get a hard card that put a 3.5-inch drive directly on the ISA slot. But all of those methods can be expensive and difficult to get, not to mention unreliable. So what do you do if you want to be free of the shackles of the floppy disk nowadays? You could install one of the floppy disk emulators that exist and have your content stored on a flash drive instead. But the much better option is one of these, an XT to IDE controller. This XT to IDE controller was sent to me by Monotech to feature in a video. It is a derivation of the Rev 4 version of the Glitchworks XT to IDE controller. This release has been dubbed Rev 5 and differs by changing the compatibility jumpers to switches, moving the EEPROM write and select options from a switch block to separate switches, a power out header, and incorporates the option to support slot 8 on the 5160 into the main board. It uses the XT IDE Universal BIOS, so it can be used as a primary boot device for the computer, and it is open source just like the Glitchworks version it is based on. I believe they are only available assembled and sell for $80. Today I will be installing it into my CGA 5150. There is a limitation in the earlier BIOS revisions on the 5150 that makes the XT IDE BIOS unable to be booted. Unfortunately, my monochrome 5150 has the last revision BIOS that still has this problem. So I've removed the one good power supply I have from there, I still need to order caps for the original PSUs, and put it in my CGA computer. That beats moving the BIOS chip around. Before I drop the card in the computer and start installing DOS, I want to cover a few of the configuration switches on here. Firstly and most importantly is the 5V out on the IDE connection. I will be using this with a compact flash adapter that's able to accept power over the IDE connection. This allows you to forego a separate power cable, but you want to be certain that it is disconnected if you plan on using anything that does not support this, such as a standard IDE hard disk. Next, the compatibility switch. You need to set this dependent on the version of the XT IDE BIOS you're using. I've linked a page on the -0 degrees site that goes into detail on this. But generally, you'll want to boot your computer at least once with the card and figure out which way you need to have this set dependent on your BIOS version. You also want to make sure that the switch blocks are set to the usual default values unless you're doing something unusual. We're almost ready to start setting this up, but really quick, I'm going to use the name hard disk to refer to the compact flash card when using it with the XT IDE. It beats saying hard disk or compact flash card or SD card or disk on module, etc., every time I want to refer to the storage device. Now, before we go ahead and put this in, there's also one more thing I want to cover about the storage media. Now I'm going to demonstrate how you can get this set up with nothing but DOS and possibly one additional program. A hard disk from IBM would have come ready to go, pre-formatted, and you were unlikely to need to make changes to it. So needing to completely wipe a drive wasn't a first install step then. But now you're more likely to be putting a used hard disk in that will need to be completely wiped. This can be tricky, and I want to demonstrate how to deal with this. So I'm going to put the compact flash card I'll be using into a Kodak camera, format it in the camera, which will make it FAT32, and I'll take a picture. Now, this is a completely incompatible partition format for the versions of DOS we will be using. Speaking of, I've spent a lot of time trying to get this set up before starting filming to find the easiest way to do it that the most people would be the most likely to get to work, and no matter what I tried, I could not get my IBM DOS 3.2 to successfully install to the hard disk. Even the directions in the manual for installing it don't work for me. So I'm going to recommend MS-DOS 3.3 as the minimum version you want to use. Now, normally I only like to use software I own, but there are a lot of DOS releases, and it's difficult to get a hold of an original Microsoft release as opposed to an OEM version. Since it was possible to natively install DOS to a hard disk, I came at this with the approach that it shouldn't be necessary to use a modern computer to pre-format or install the OS to the hard disk before putting it into the 5150. So I'm going to take the compact flash card straight out of my camera and put it into the XT IDE adapter and close the case and put it back together. I won't need to access the card again. Now let's get this started. When the computer boots up, it will display a new menu from the XT IDE BIOS asking you what device you want to boot from. It will fail on the hard disk as it is right now because it isn't properly formatted or have an OS. So I'm going to put in the MS-DOS 3.3 disk and boot that by pressing A at the menu now. From here, the first thing you'll need to do is completely wipe the partition information off of the hard disk. Fdisk isn't going to be of any help because it refuses to touch non-DOS partitions. And even if it did, this version doesn't clean up the initial sector of the drive. So there are two options from here. The more period correct option would be to open up debug and put in a small assembler program that zeroes out the first sector. Or possibly an easier solution if you're able to make your own floppy disks is to download wipe disk from Lowtech and run that to zero the first sector. For me, I can make floppy disks, so the latter was easier, so I didn't bother doing the debug option. An additional third option may work for you if you're using DOS 5 or higher, where you can just run the fdisk command with the /mbr option. Any way you do it, after you've zeroed out the first sector, you need to restart. The system needs to refresh the partition info about the drive. Once booted back up, you can open fdisk to create your partition. The version of DOS I'm using doesn't support partitions greater than 32 megabytes, but DOS 4 and higher can do 2 gigs. Once your partition is made, double check that it is set active, which is what makes it bootable, and exit fdisk. It will restart again. Once you're back, you can run format C/S. This command combines formatting the drive with the sys command to copy over the boot files. After that is done, your drive is technically bootable, but lacks all of the DOS utilities. So we're going to make a subdirectory on the hard disk and name it DOS. This is where I would recommend putting all of the DOS programs so you don't clutter up the root directory. Now you could probably get away with just running copy, but I'm going to use xcopy, which is on disk 2 of DOS 3.3, which makes it inconvenient. So I'm going to run xcopy a:/** to c:/DOS to copy all the files there. And once that transfer is finished, you'll want to run the command again on the second disk to get the rest of the files. Now that everything's on the hard drive, you're going to need to tell the command interpreter where to find the files when you want to run them. So go to the root of the drive and run copy con autoexe.bat. Now this will create a new text file, and we're going to have to type in the contents. So let's start with echo off, enter, then path equals c:/DOS, enter, then hit Ctrl-Z and enter again to save the file. But after doing that, you should be done. Pull out your floppy disk and go ahead and reboot. I'll make a note here that there is a program specifically for installing DOS to a hard disk called Select, and you could use that instead, but it will put all the files in the root of the drive in the earlier versions of DOS. DOS 5 and greater is also a bit different, so I'll quickly go through that. I've taken a new 1GB card and sold the partition table of that and put it into the computer. So if you try and use the DOS 5 installer, it will fail because it still doesn't want to touch the non-DOS drives. But now you can drop to DOS with F3, put in disk 2 of DOS 5 because that's where fdisk is, and run fdisk/mbr to wipe the first sector and start fresh. Then you'll need to go back and create a partition in fdisk to put everything in, and you'll want to manually run the format command on it. If you don't, then the DOS installer program will fail, and I'm not quite sure why. All it has to do is run format, but nonetheless, it does. But after that, the install program will continue normally. This install takes a long time over 5 disks, and it won't use both drives. And in the end, I don't know if the WinWorld copy is bad or my disk didn't write correctly, but the shell doesn't start for me after it finishes. It's more likely, though, that my 256K system can't run it since it can't even launch edit. So I'll be sticking with DOS 3.3 for now. Alright, and that's it. The 5150 set up and booting from the XT IDE adapter. No more swapping floppy disks. So, I guess at this point I would demonstrate software running on it, but, well, Jeopardy? So I still don't have anything else that'll actually just run on my 5150. Well, I do. I have Vet, I have Stunt Driver, I have Print Shop, and as I've shown in another video, Flight Simulator 2.1. However, the 5 1/4 for Flight Simulator stopped working, so I've never been able to try it on a 5150. It just worked the one time for the new 98 video, and then immediately stopped. And everything else here, all the rest of my software, needs more memory. So it won't run at all. It just tells me won't fit in memory. That is, mostly except for one thing. Multiply and Divide by Dinosoft. And conveniently enough, this is also a CGA application. So let's try something new that, I mean, it's new. Not necessarily good, but it's new. This release is kind of particularly funny because this is all it comes with in the registration card, but the game itself actually has something else under the label. So this was previously another program before they distributed it. So hopefully they didn't write it first, so it hasn't been rewritten. But all right, let's go. So one nice thing about the Dino Multiply and Divide is it actually has an installer, so we can try installing it to the hard disk. Yes, yeah, okay. Alright, so now we can change to Moldiv in C. And weird. So, Dino came out in 1991. Kind of a late release. You know, being 10 years later in this computer and still running on it. Oh, wow. Okay. Let's do this. Bam. Times tables? I don't know. It's never gotten this far. I've only tried to run it off the floppy disk and always tells me I run out of memory. Okay, so it's actually gonna work. Wow, okay, cool. So, demo? Is it gonna do it for me now? Oh, wow. Okay. Well, I mean, it is kid software, so. Alright, well, hey, actually, at least it worked. That's really weird. It would not run off the floppy disk. Yeah, here we go. Dino. There we go. Well, permission denied. I guess that's not quite the same as running out of memory. I thought it ran out of RAM. I guess it just has to be installed then. Well, alright, that makes sense. So, hey, at least I got something that runs on this. And, yeah, it's thanks to having the hard disk installed. So, cool. Well, I think that's about everything I wanted to cover on the Monotech XT IDE adapter. I want to say thanks to JD for sending this to me to take a look at. It's definitely worth checking out if you're interested in getting one of these. I think he's going to be making some changes to it. He still has some available, but may do some compact flash only versions in the future because they're easier to manufacture and they'd be a little bit lower cost. So if you are interested, I've put some links below. And if you do have one of these, I hope my install directions were useful because I had a heck of a time getting this going, and there really isn't a lot of documentation out there on how to get the hard disk formatted or getting everything set up, so it took a lot of trial and error. Of course, most of that was me trying to get DOS 3.2 installed from IBM, which it has to be possible. I swear Modern Classic did it in his video, so I don't see why it didn't work for me, but it didn't. So, well, anyway. I hope you guys enjoyed that, and I'll see you next time.